Well, we're talking about the climb, and it's got me thinking about a few years ago. I was a pastor in Colby. I was the associate pastor in Colby, and we took our confirmation kids to the mountains for our confirmation retreat. Colby's not that far from the mountains, and so we took all of our kids, and one day we took them snowshoeing. And so we went to a mountain shop, and we got these big snowshoes. I was thinking like the ones I've seen on movies where it's like a stick, and then it's got some lashing. Actually, new snowshoes look like giant, flat plastic frisbees, and they're really awkward and gangly on land, but they really work. And so we grabbed all of our kids' snowshoes and we got them to the base of a mountain and we took them up on a climb. And I'd never been snowshoeing before. I mean, it was something I'd never done before, but we got to see frozen rivers and actually a giant frozen lake and some beautiful snowfall and the sun coming through snowy, beautiful mountains. It was incredible. The views were totally worth all that we went through to get there. But at the same time, snowshoeing is really hard work. Have any of y'all ever been snowshoeing before? Melissa has. Melissa and I were on the same trip. Okay, Skelly's have a few more. Okay, awesome. So snowshoeing is hard work. Some of y'all can attest to that. It wasn't hard for some of our members. Leading our pack was Jim. Jim was my boss. Jim was a trail runner. Jim had a house in the mountains that we were climbing. Jim had climbed the path that we were going to take dozens, if not maybe even hundreds of times. So for Jim, getting up the mountain and back down, like he could have jogged this a couple times in the time the rest of us would have walked it. Also with us, we had two other adult leaders. Their names were Heather and Monty. Heather and Monty were co-owners of the CrossFit gym in town. Heather and Monty had a shared 2% body fat between both of them combined. Heather and Monty had no problems. And then there was me, and someone had to bring up the rear. So we were in charge of all these 6th and 7th and 8th grade kids, and I don't know if you've remember middle school, but that's the age at which like your body starts to change and like your limbs get a little gangly, and like I at least was the kid that would find myself falling standing over, like just coordination wasn't catching up yet for myself. And then we're gonna take these kids and we're gonna stick them on the top of a mountain covered in ice with these giant like sleds to their feet. This seemed like a lot of fun, right? And there were times that it was fun to watch. There were times that it was hard, but as tough as this was, the kids were incredible. And you know, snowshoeing is hard work, but our kids had big hearts, and it was really cool. As tough as it was, and as great as these kids were, there's one kid that sticks out, and her name was Emma. Emma was a 6th grader. She was probably the youngest, maybe the second youngest out of our whole group. Emma was still growing, and Emma had an incredible heart. Emma was the type of kid that wanted to make sure everybody around her was having a good time, even if that meant she had to work harder. And so Emma, as we were climbing this mountain, had brought along a backpack, and it was full of water bottles and sunscreen and snacks for everybody, not just for herself, but to make sure that everybody was having a good time. And that tells you a lot about her character, but it's also heavy when you're climbing a mountain, trying to keep up with 2 CrossFit coaches and a trail runner, and you've got a backpack full of supplies for everybody else. Emma had to work hard. So as we start climbing this mountain, things start out easy, and the kids are laughing and having fun. You know, this is a new experience, and when a kid trips and falls into a snowbank, it's hilarious the first 87 times, right? I mean, it's a lot of fun. But as we go farther, the air begins to get a little bit thinner, and the legs begin to feel a little bit heavier. And little by little, the kids get a little farther spaced out, and the talking and laughing starts to fade away and gets replaced with heavy breathing, and little by little by little, we take longer and longer breaks, definitely for the kids, not for Bill, definitely for the kids. Little by little, kids get tired. And at one point, I look back at Emma, and I was a little surprised at first, but I see she's got tears running down her face. There are parts where her body is just so tired that all she can do is crawl forward. She's exhausted. And she's trying to keep up with everybody else, but she just can't. And she's working so hard to do this, and she's frustrated. And at first I worry that, you know, she's frustrated because she's missing out on the views, or she's frustrated because she's not having fun. But then I talked to her for a second and realized, no, she's frustrated because she's worried that she's holding everybody else back. I mean, this is just the heart of that girl. She's awesome. She's worried that everybody else is going to have less fun if things keep going this way. And I watch as she's crawling forward. And I watch as the tears are on her face and the frustration is just welling in her body. And that's when I see for the first time just how good of a guide my boss was. My boss, this trail running pastor named Jim, this guy who'd been up and down this mountain dozens of times, comes alongside Emma. And he doesn't bark at her, he doesn't yell and say, you need to hurry up. He comes alongside her. And he says, hey, Emma, this part here is kind of tough, and there's two routes you can take. You go this way or that way. I think you should take it this way. And he guides her up the right route for this pass. And then he shows her, hey, when you get to a really tough part like this, turn sideways and step up. It's a little easier. You won't slip as much. And then he encourages her, Emma, keep going. You can do this. You can do this. Mountaineers talk about the importance of having a guide, a mountain guide, someone who can help you and teach you how to get up a tough mountain face. They show you what the right route is, and they teach you to use the equipment, and they take responsibility to encourage you when things are tough to keep going. Mountaineers and mountain climbers know how essential a guide is in the rough spots. And the more I understand this, the more I kind of wish that we had someone like that in every area of our lives. See, we all have tough things that we face. It would be nice if we had someone who could guide us up the tough routes. Last week, we kicked off this sermon series on the climb, and we're talking about how God calls us almost metaphorically up a mountain, how God has this view of holy life for us, that we're called to look like Jesus, to act like Jesus, to love other people the way that Jesus loved other people, to care for the world around us the way that Jesus cared for each of us, and how sometimes that feels like a climb. But how do we, in the midst of this, as we're starting this out, how do we as people know which route to take up that mountain? See, it's easy to look at the top of a mountain and say, I want to go up there. But how do we know which of the many routes in front of us gets us there from here? Parents, I hear, understand this especially well. You get inundated as soon as you announce you're pregnant or as soon as you have a child with information and parenting techniques, and there's way more on the internet than you could ever know what to do with, and it all seems to contradict itself. And how do you know which route leads you to well-adjusted, loving, respectful kids with scholarships to the perfect university? You know what you're looking for, and which route is going to lead you to where your kids don't really listen to you or like you as much? Which route is the right route? This is true in other areas of our life as well. For those of us who are dating, Valentine's Day is next week. Which is the route that's going to take us to happiness and a good marriage, and which is the route that takes us to bad habits and broken hearts? For those of us who are in our work lives or our school lives, which route takes us to success on our projects, to good grades in what we do, and which route leads us to a bad relationship with our boss or our teacher or our principal? We want to know which route is the right route. But how do we pick that one? Do we listen to everybody around us and do what everybody else is doing? I mean, that's one safe way to do things. Do we kind of follow the pack, follow the herd? And, I don't know if looking for advice from people who are no farther along the route than we are is always the safest idea. How do we know which route is the right route? Who can guide us? Now, this is doubly important in our spiritual lives, isn't it? I mean, our spiritual lives, our faith, our relationship with God is going to impact everything else we do. It's going to be what gives us hope in the hard times. It's going to be what is the foundation of our morals. It's going to be what directs how we relate to the people around us. But if we're talking about how do we begin this path of discipleship, how do we try to look more like God every single day, or like God would have us look, how do we know which route takes us there? There's this guy in the Bible who struggles with this question. His name is Joshua. Maybe you've heard of him. He actually has his own book in the Bible, but he's not one of the most famous characters. Joshua is born as a slave in 1350 BC. He's born in Egypt. He's one of the Hebrew slaves under the dominion of Pharaoh. He's one of the Hebrew slaves who follows Moses. When Moses leads all of these people after this big showdown with Pharaoh, Moses says, "Let my people go," and then leads a great mass into the wilderness. Joshua is one of those people. Joshua follows after Moses and actually begins to work with Moses, to help Moses. Joshua becomes what's called the assistant or the aide to Moses. He's Moses' right hand. And Joshua is with Moses as they try to organize these people that have been slaves their whole lives, and now they're a wandering nomadic nation. Joshua is with Moses as they move from watering hole to watering hole, trying to find a place to survive the night. Joshua is even with Moses as they stand on the banks of the promised land, looking ahead at everything they've been looking for their whole lives, preparing to enter and also preparing for a really tough entrance. Joshua is with Moses when Moses goes up the mountain and meets God and comes down with the Ten Commandments. Joshua follows Moses. He's the shadow of Moses. And eventually, Joshua takes over for Moses. He's faced with an incredibly tough task. See, Moses is 120 years old, or at least that's what the story tells us. Moses is 120 years old when they get to the banks of the promised land. And he's suffering from extreme old age, and Moses knows he can't go much farther. He doesn't have enough left in him for the task of taking and establishing the promised land. And so Moses looks at Joshua and says, I know this is the hardest thing we've ever done as a people, but you're up. And Joshua knows the challenges ahead of him are far greater than anything behind him. They're going to have to worry about powerful people and fortified cities. They're going to have to establish rule, establish law, establish a whole new government. And it's going to be Joshua's first act as a leader of his people. And Joshua is looking ahead, wondering, which route do I take? Joshua has no chance in the midst of this. That's too hard of a burden for any young leader, any inexperienced leader. Joshua has no chance except one. Joshua has God on his side, and Joshua has Moses to be his experienced guide. Moses is the guy who's literally been up the mountain before. Moses is the guy who's led these people, and now Moses teaches and trains and passes on the mantle to Joshua. This is a theme we see throughout the Bible. Many of the famous characters that we remember, many of the names that we recognize, have somebody else training them and teaching them along the way. Mary, the mother of Jesus, the most important woman in the entire Bible, bar none, goes to her cousin Elizabeth for training. Timothy, the leader of the church in Ephesus, the second biggest and most important church in the ancient world, is constantly seeking wisdom from Paul. Even the disciples, Peter, James, John, these guys whose names are big in our faith, we remember that most importantly, they are the people who are discipled by Jesus. This is a theme we see as people in the Bible are seeking guidance from people who are a little farther on the path. This has been big for many of us, and for me personally as well. I look at anything that I feel like I know how to do well, whether that's in my physical life or my professional life, or most of all in my spiritual life. And most of those things I can look at and tell you, here's who taught me that. That was my grandmother who taught me how to pray. That was my grandfather who taught me how to work. That was my father who taught me how to speak. Many of us can look, and there's a coach, there's a teacher, there's a parent or a sibling who taught us and guided us in everything that matters within us. Maybe you have somebody who is your guide, your coach, your leader. Maybe it's time to find somebody. To find that person you know that cares about you, and that person who you look at and say, you seem to have navigated the things that I'm starting to face. Can I take you out to a cup of coffee and just pick your brain for an hour? Can we sit down? Of course it's coffee, right? Can we just sit down and talk? How do I get from where I am to where you've been? What do I need to learn? What skills do I need to acquire? What roadblocks will I have to overcome? Sometimes we need to reach out to somebody ahead of us, to somebody who can guide us and say, hey, I need some help here. You're a person who's done what I'm trying to do. In any area of our life, but especially our spiritual, how can I learn from you? Who is your Moses? Who is your wise, experienced guide? Who's going to take responsibility and direct you and equip you and encourage you along this path towards discipleship? Now, we're supposed to have a Moses, and many of us get that. You know, as kids, we have incredible teachers, and we remember the lessons. We remember our coaches and what they taught us and how they encouraged us and pushed us and how all of that formed us. Many of us understand that we're supposed to have a Moses, and we can even extrapolate that to our faith. But the other side's important too. Just as we are called to be a Moses to someone else, to be a guide to someone else, we're also called, as we're called to be a Joshua to someone else, we're also called to be a Moses to someone else. Before we write it off and think that we wouldn't be good guides and that we're not old enough or experienced enough or wise enough yet, and I know it's tempting, especially at my age, to think that, I want to push you here. Because I think that every single one of us are called to reach out to people around us, to people who are just a little bit farther back on this mountain than us, a little bit farther down the route than us, and give them a hand up. Moses is all about taking responsibility for someone not quite as far down the route. So last Sunday, the very first prayer request I was handed came from a young man in our congregation. Jacob Marins was praying for his little brother. Sometimes guiding someone means taking responsibility for them when they're sick, when they can't make it to church, and asking other people to pray for them. Sometimes guiding someone else is setting an example for a little brother. Now, Jacob, you're in third grade, right? Okay. So anybody who wants to say that they're not quite old enough to guide somebody else, I'm sure he'd be willing to listen to your excuses. That was awesome last week. I'm proud of you, man. That was really cool. Being a guide doesn't mean that you've climbed every mountain. It doesn't mean that you know everything. Being a guide means that you're willing to reach back to somebody else and say, hey, welcome. I'm going to help you, and I'm going to care for you, and I'm going to do what I can to get you one step farther up this mountain together. Every single one of us are called to do that. When we recruit our life group leaders and our confirmation mentors, our youth volunteers, we don't look for people who have memorized the whole Bible. That's great, but that's not our first question. We don't sit you down with a Scantron sheet full of biblical trivia and say, if you can answer 45 of these right, you can volunteer here. That's never happened, as far as I'm aware. What we do look for is people who have a heart for the people around them. People who say, hey, I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to at least be real about that with somebody. People who are willing to say, hey, in my life group or my Sunday school class, I want to reach out to everybody else and I want to help them up. And I'll be willing to share my experiences and what I know about the Bible. And you don't have to know the whole Bible to do that. You just have to be willing to take responsibility for somebody else's growth in a meaningful way. Wherever you are on the climb to which God has called all of us, this climb that we call discipleship or holy living, there are people who are a little newer to this thing than you, who need you to guide them. This is important, but it's also easier than we might expect. This passage we read in the Bible today, this passage from the book of Deuteronomy, is packed full of a couple practical things we can do, and we're going to unpack them a little bit. This is the scripture that Steve read. This is Deuteronomy 31, 7 and 8. Then Moses called Joshua, and with all of Israel watching, said to him, be strong, be fearless, because you are the one who will lead this people to the land the Lord swore to their ancestors to give to them. You are the one who will divide up the land for them, but the Lord is the one who is marching before you. He is the one who will be with you. He won't let you down. He won't abandon you. Don't be afraid or scared. You know, I can't imagine hearing those words from Moses. I can't imagine the feeling in Joshua as he faces that. There's a lot here, but I want to highlight a few different things. And my hope here in this is not just that you'll learn something, but that this is something that you might apply when you look at how you raise your kids and teach them about faith. This is something that you might apply when you are with your life group and there's someone there who seems like they're new and kind of struggling with something. This is something you might apply at work with your coworkers. This is something that all of us can use. First, Moses gives Joshua direction. He says, you are the one who will lead this people to the land the Lord swore to their ancestors to give to them. He tells Joshua, he guides him to what he is called to do. We are called to guide other people, to show them the direction in which we are going, to guide them into what we are called to be doing. When we're kids, this is something we do with our little siblings as we show them, hey, you should listen to our parents. I learned that the hard way. You learned that the hard way, right? You teach your little siblings to listen to your parents and be very obedient, right? I didn't. This is something that looks like coaching our kids in sports. This is something in our spiritual lives that's huge. It's walking with people who are just starting really tough spiritual journeys, whether that's walking through a miscarriage or sobriety or addiction or questions that are just tough to answer. Those climbs that are really rough, sometimes we give direction to other people and say, hey, this is the way that we can go. Here are some practical directions we can do. As a church, we give direction with our lives. We give direction when we live our lives in such a way that all who see us want to know the God who made us. Part of giving direction is pointing the way to which we are to go. Next, Moses gives him the equipment he needs for the climb he's going to make. Moses calls to Joshua, and with all of Israel watching, said to him, "Be strong and fearless, because you are the one who will lead." Moses is about to lead a mass of thousands of people who are very, very loosely organized, and so Moses gathers all of them. And he pulls Joshua into the middle and says, this guy, he's in charge. He has no experience yet, but he's the guy who's going to lead you to where you are called to go. This is an important part of guiding those around us. We give them the tools they need, the equipment they need. Sometimes it's training them in how to do things. Sometimes it might be at work where you give a younger coworker some advice, but also some of your own influence, some of your own authority if necessary. In our spiritual lives, it's giving people the tools they need to grow in their faith. It's teaching a new Christian, here's how we pray, and I'm going to do the scary thing and pray in front of you and with you. That's terrifying to some people. But we model it and show them and teach them. It's showing people who are new to the faith, here's how you read your Bible, and there's parts that are easier to read and parts that are tougher to read, and so you start in, say, the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew. You don't start in the 3rd chapter of Numbers where it's going to be 47 chapters in a row of names, and people are going to go, what is going on? I'm not going to do a sermon series on Numbers anytime soon. Sometimes we equip people with what they need to grow their faith. And finally, Moses encourages Joshua. The Lord is the one who is marching before you. Don't be afraid or scared. We got to encourage people. Joshua gets a reputation for being this big, heroic, mighty warrior. And I think he does some mighty and heroic things, but I also think that you only tell somebody don't be afraid or scared if they're gonna be afraid or scared, right? And Joshua hears that more than any other character in the Bible. There's multiple times, the entire 1st chapter of Joshua is God saying, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. I think Joshua's terrified. But Moses encourages him to keep going. We're called to encourage other people around us, to encourage our classmates and our coworkers who are just exhausted and overwhelmed with projects, just to send them a simple text and say, hey, you're gonna make it, you're gonna be okay. To encourage new Christians or people who are restarting this journey for the first time and to say, hey, I know it seems overwhelming at times, but you can do this, to provide people hope in the simple act of encouragement. Guiding people, being Moses to someone, is pretty simple when you break it down. It's directing them and showing them which way to go, what way up the mountain. It's equipping them and giving them the tools they need to succeed, and it's encouraging them to take those first steps. The thing about that encouragement is sometimes it goes both ways. Remember my friend Emma, the 6th grade girl with tears down her face? Her story doesn't stop halfway up the mountain. Jim came alongside of her and guided her and equipped her and encouraged her. And little by little, she began to crawl and walk and move forward. And her head was down, so she didn't even really notice as she passed the rest of us while we were taking a break. And Jim stepped back as she alone crawls and reaches the top of our trail and walks out onto this huge, beautiful frozen lake surrounded by a back bowl of a mountain, and looks around and just goes, wow. What do you think Jim enjoyed more? Reaching the top of a mountain that he'd climbed dozens of times, or that feeling of wonder and amazement on the face of a little girl who amazed even herself? Because of her guide and because of her heart, She picked the right route, and she reached the peak. Because of her guide, her story doesn't stop halfway up the mountain. Yours doesn't have to either. Mine doesn't have to either. Your kids, your coworkers, your neighbors, theirs doesn't have to either. Be a Moses to someone. Guide them. Sit down for coffee with them. Pray with them. Even if that's a little scary for you, that's okay. You don't have to know everything. But we're all called to have a guide and to be a guide. So may we be the church who follow this fiercely and who look around and make sure that nobody's story stops halfway up the mountain. Let's pray.